All right, we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. And in Ecclesiastes, Solomon is asking the big questions of life. He recognizes that this world is broken, fundamentally broken because of man's sin. And so he's stepping back and testing life, you might say, and trying to figure out what really is the meaning of it all. And honestly, he's very upfront about one of his conclusions, one of his primary conclusions. In chapter 1, verse 2, we find one of the major themes of the book, which is that life is vanity. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And that phrase is repeated at the very end of the preacher's message as well. Chapter 12, verse 8. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity. And then the exact middle of the book is Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10. So the verse right before that, which you might say is the conclusion to the first half of the book, is this also is vanity and striving after the wind. And then the introduction to the second half of the book asks basically the same question as the first. For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life? The Hebrew word is actually hevel, which we translate meaningless or vain, and is found about 38 times throughout the book. And it's kind of a difficult word to capture. It's a word that's a picture, really. It means puff of air. Sometimes even it's used for smoke. And those are probably pretty good illustrations of how Solomon is using it here. Life is like a puff of air. It's here, then it's gone, and that was it. Smoke maybe is better. Life is like smoke. Smoke is real, but it has this unique quality. When I reach out my hands to grab it, there's nothing there. Now there's two aspects as we look throughout Ecclesiastes to the vanity of life. We say that life under the sun is like smoke. But what exactly does that mean? It means, one, it's hard to understand life. A word that some people use to capture the meaning of hevel is the English word enigma. So that's part of it. It's something that's hard to understand. It's like the author knows life is supposed to be something big. We were created by God and we were created for God. But then he tries to figure it out as the world stands right now after the curse, exactly how it can be something big. And he keeps struggling to understand. And this is something he brings out, especially throughout the second half of the book. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that a man may not find out anything that will be after him. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I've not found. He says in 8:17, I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil and seek, and he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Over and over, chapter 10, verses 14 and 15. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Over and over and over and over, the writer says, I tried to figure it out, and I don't fully grasp it. Life. And one of the things that makes it so hard to understand is just how fleeting it is. And that's part of the idea behind hevel as well. It is an enigma life, and one of the reasons why it's an enigma is because it's temporary life. And the temporariness of life makes it so hard to figure out its meaning. Because if you're just looking at life under the sun by itself, what do you gain? It's like the author's saying in Ecclesiastes, let's take a look at life as it is under the sun. It's hard to understand because it's here and it's gone, and what is it? What have you gained? And that's chapter 1, verse 3. And chapter 1, verse 3 captures one of the big questions of Ecclesiastes. What does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils at under the sun? Chapter 2, verse 11. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. What does a man gain? He says, I looked. It didn't seem like I gained anything. And one of the reasons it's so hard to see what a man gains by all his work is because of how quickly he dies, and how quickly after he dies that everything he's done is gone. That's a big part of the reason life under the sun is hard to understand. It's hard to find meaning in life under the sun because one of the primary consequences of the fall is the fact that we all die. We're here. Maybe we make a big impact. Maybe we don't. Either way, we die and we're gone. I was just reading this week about someone named Robert Schuller, and Robert Schuller was not a biblical pastor at all, but he was a pretty famous pastor, and he built, if you want to call it a church or a business, either way, it's more a business. He built a big business that called itself a church, and while he was alive, I mean, people were flocking to learn from him. How do I build a church as big as yours? He even apparently had an impact on Mikhail Gorbachev, and some people say he had an impact on that part of history. And anyway, he was a big deal in his lifetime, but now he's gone. And I was reading an article about Robert Schuller, and someone was talking, a seminary professor was talking about how few of his students had even heard of him. And I mean, it's not very long after. And that's Ecclesiastes, good or bad. You do good, you do bad, you work hard, you become really famous, you don't become famous, you die, you're gone. And this is a real issue for him. He brings it up over and over and over again. Chapter 2, verse 14. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, and yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Chapter 2, verse 18. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Chapter 3, verse 2, there's a time to be born and a time to die. Chapter 3, verse 19. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so does the other. Chapter 4, verse 16. There was no end of all the people, all whom he led, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. He was a great king, but the people who come later didn't even know who he was. I often think this when I see a statue. If you had a statue made of you, you would probably think, this is just huge. I have a statue made of me. I'm so famous. But how many, when you see a statue, how many of those guys do you even recognize? Most of those statues, they were really famous people in their time, powerful people in their time, but now they're mostly places where birds, sit on and go to the bathroom, and nobody really even recognizes them. Over and over, I could read more and more verses here. Chapter 5, verse 15, chapter 6, verse 12. This is a real issue for him, death, and it's a real issue for us. You can imagine, God creates this perfect world. It's designed to work a certain way, and the way it's designed to work is beautiful, but now there's death, and it's like death has made a glitch in the system. And I think Solomon goes about writing this book the way he does because he knows of how often we ignore the reality of death. He's trying to wake us up. Because when we ignore the reality of death, we live and think and act in very foolish ways as a result. It's obvious we're going to die, and yet we don't believe it, most of us. We don't believe it. I remember a couple years ago, I was sitting in the doctor's office with my wife, and we had just discovered she had cancer, and it was like, whoa. This happens to other people. This doesn't happen to us, We're going to live forever. Well, we're going to die unless Jesus returns. We're going to die. It's a wake-up call, and it seems so obvious, and yet so few of us take it very seriously. And so Solomon's trying to confront us as clearly as he can with the ways that death creates problems to life. Life is confusing because we die so quickly, and there are two big ways that death complicates life specifically. The first he brings up at the beginning of the book. It's found in verses 3 through 11 of chapter 1, where he shows that after you die, time will eventually erase you and everything you care about. It's like our life is a castle on the shore, a sand castle. You make this big castle during the day, you go back up to wherever you're staying, come back the next day, that castle's gone because the ocean has just wiped it out. There's no trace. That's like our lives. That's what time does to our lives. And so Solomon looks to man's future after death and shows that thinking you're going to find meaning in your life right now because of something here on earth as it is after you die, then you really are searching in the wrong place, because people won't really remember you or care about you after you die. And actually, even if they did care about you, you're not going to be there to really get any benefit from it. Your whole life, you're doing all these things, but it's like building a sandcastle, really, and the ocean waves of time will roll in eventually and wipe it all away. People live, people die, and yet the earth keeps standing. And he basically looks at us in comparison to the earth in the first chapter. We do all these things, but nothing ever really fundamentally changes. He says, is there a thing of which it said, see, this is new? It's already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. That's the first problem that death creates. He ends the book with a second problem, chapter 11, verses 7 and following, saying basically that if meaning has to be found in this life and in the here and now, you really are going to have an impossible time doing that, because the time you have here on earth before you die isn't really very long in comparison with how long you'll be dead. And besides, even the time you are here on earth, of that time you have, there isn't a whole lot of time that you're strong enough to enjoy it. He's talking about the temporariness even of just your life right now. He's saying if you're really trying to find meaning in life through something you did, through your own efforts, you're really going to end up disappointed, because you're going to get old quickly. And you're going to build all this stuff and you're not even going to be able to enjoy it. If we're looking for meaning in life, it's a challenge in this sin-cursed world because of death. It makes life a real enigma. One, because what you do really doesn't last. And because two, you don't really last that long here on earth. So what do we do now? How are we supposed to live? And in chapters 1 through 6, Solomon begins to answer that question by looking at what humans often focus their lives on during their short time here on earth in order to make the most out of it, and shows that those options don't really work very well. It's like, let's experiment. How do people often try to deal with this? You see his question in chapter 2, verse 3. I search with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. What's good to do? Oh, let me test. And to answer that question, he examines some of the ways we try to discover meaning and make life work in light of the fact that we're going to die and die fairly quickly. And it's almost like he comes at this from the perspective of an unbeliever and says, okay, let's look at all the ways that we try to discover meaning in life and make it work, and see if any of those ways actually make sense. And he begins by looking at three things in particular: knowledge, pleasure, and money. And he says they all fall short. They're all going to be wrong answers. They don't solve the problem of death. They don't bring meaning to life. He starts with knowledge or wisdom. Chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. And what did wisdom do? Wisdom only made him see the problems in life more clearly. I searched out wisdom. And he says, I discovered it's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. All is vanity and striving after the wind, because there's something broken in this world that you and I can't fix. I gained wisdom, and what good was wisdom? It only caused more anxiety. The more I learned, the more I grieved. Then let's try pleasure. And this is chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And self-indulgence didn't work. He says, I'll test you with pleasure. This is like an experiment. And he tries everything. And yet what did he find at the end? Vanity. Next he comes back to wisdom and folly. And he compares the two. Chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And he says, you know what? The same thing happens to the wise person and the fool. Wisdom's better than folly, because it's better to have light than it is to live in darkness. but both wise people and foolish people die. And this causes him to hate life. And you know what? He just goes on. Let's look at work. Working hard, chapter 2, verses 18 through 26. Working hard doesn't guarantee anything. He looks at all that his work had accomplished, and he realizes, I'm just going to have to leave it to someone else who didn't work for it and who might not even use it for good. Now, part of what makes this so confusing, I think, is that Solomon knows that there's a deeper meaning to life. And so, again, he just takes us deeper into the frustration in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And he says, God has a purpose for what happens. In chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, we know we're made for eternity. That's why we're always asking the questions we're asking. We're not animals. And yet sometimes it actually seems like God is trying to make us feel like we are. After all, there's all the sin where there should be righteousness, chapter 3, verse 16. And as a result, it looks like, from our perspective, that man and animals aren't all that different, chapter 3, verse 17 and following. If all we're doing is looking at life from man's perspective, then we have a real problem, because we know there's a purpose and that we're created for something huge, and yet death and the difficulties of life make it seem like we aren't really better than the animals. So what do? We try to enjoy life, but that's very difficult given all the wickedness in the world. In chapter 4, it's like Solomon comes back to these answers the unbelieving world often gives and just continues to slowly pick apart this hope that some people have of trying to find meaning in this life apart from God. If you say, well, okay, we're like animals, let's just enjoy, you're going to find that difficult because there's so much oppression all around us. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, there's so much injustice and oppression that makes it difficult even just to survive. If you say, I'm going to work hard, you'll find that most people work hard for bad reasons, chapter 4, verse 4. But being lazy isn't really helpful because it creates so much difficulty in one's life. People work so hard for things that don't satisfy them. They ruin relationships in order to get more, when the more they get doesn't bring them as much joy as a few good friendships, chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. And even with all the good things being wise can bring you, death will take that meaning all away, chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. Again, after looking at all these problems that death creates in life, he's going to give us some wisdom for dealing with this. But before we look at exactly what he says, let's see the way he identifies some of the wrong, inadequate solutions. How do we deal with this mess in life? How about government? Government, chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Probably going to be corrupt, but necessary. But it's probably going to be corrupt and make life hard. Money, chapter 5, verse 10 through 6, 8. If you get a lot, it won't satisfy you. The more you get, the more people will want from you. And you won't even sleep as well as the simple laborer. It's difficult to hold on to your riches. And in the end, even if you hold on to your riches your entire life, you're going to die and then they're gone. The key to enjoying wealth is not in your hands. It's in God's, which means if you're looking at this life and looking for meaning in this life apart from God, you aren't going to find it. Here's Solomon's summary answer. Chapter 6, verse 12. For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? You remember the question in chapter 2, verse 3. I wanted to see what was good for the children of man. What is good for the children of man? Chapter 2, verse 3. Chapter 6, verse 12. Who knows? Who knows? Now, I think the second half of the book gets more positive. It starts giving more answers. He doesn't end there. This is just a pause in the middle. But even still, we can start with some of the answers he's already given. And the hint in the first part of the book is that if you can't find meaning in life apart from God, stop trying to find meaning in life apart from God. Instead, make it your goal to enjoy the life that God has given you now by looking to God for the ability to enjoy it. It's possible to enjoy life, but it's a gift from God. You have to look to him for this. Chapter 2, verse 24. There's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This I saw is from the hand of God. Chapter 3, verse 12. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. This is God's gift to man. Chapter 3, verse 22. So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Chapter 5, verse 18 through chapter 6, verse 2. Behold, what I've seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. And then he goes on to say that this comes from God. So the first key, if you can't find life, if you can't find meaning in life apart from God, stop trying to find meaning in life apart from God. Instead, go to God and ask him for the simple ability to enjoy life. And then his second hint is fear God. Fear God. And this is chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Take seriously your relationship with God. Be careful in your worship. Come to God to learn. Be honest in what you promise God. Fear him. And so that's a beginning. Like I said, the first half of the book asks a question. It comes to a pretty difficult conclusion. Who knows? But even as he says that, he's giving us hints. But like I said, I think the second half of the book is giving us more answers. And he begins in chapter 7 by looking at what is good in a sin-cursed world. You remember he asked in chapter 6, verse 12, who knows what is good for a man? And at the beginning of chapter 7, he actually himself provides some answers. A good name, death, funerals, sorrow, rebukes, patience, wisdom, recognizing God's sovereignty over all things, making wise choices, fearing God, wisdom, humility, staying away from sinful women, a godly wife, understanding the real source of man's problem. Those are overall goods, and yet they're difficult, obviously, to obtain because of the problems in this world. And so in chapter 8, he starts working through some specific helps for living life in a messed up world. And you find 7 main lessons there. First of all, he talks about how to deal with sinful, foolish authorities in chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. Submit. Recognize that when you leave the king, you will lose your opportunity to influence the king. Stay away from the evil things that he does, but recognize how difficult it is to correct or stop him. Keep working for good causes. Wait for your time to correct him. Stay hopeful even while you feel the suffering of others. Remember that even though a wicked king may be powerful, he will die, and his evil won't accomplish good ends. Don't envy the wicked, but fear God. So he teaches us how to deal with foolish authorities. Chapter 8, verses 10 through 13, how to deal with the wicked who seem to be prospering. Chapter 8, verse 14 through 9:12, acknowledge the complexity of life and enjoy what you can. Not everyone gets what he deserves in this life. Try to be joyful because you can't know all that God is doing. Everyone's in God's hands and everyone dies. Life is better than death because the living know that they will die and can work on enjoying their life while they're still living. Knowing that death is coming, seek to enjoy life because you don't know when you're going to die. Fourth, don't think of wisdom as being able to do more than it can, but still recognize its value. This is chapter 9, verse 13 through 10:20. Wisdom doesn't always accomplish what you think it could, but it's still good. It's better to be with poor wise people than rich fools. Why? A little folly makes an honorable person shameful. Folly takes you the wrong direction. Your folly shames you, is evident to all. You're going to need wisdom when dealing with people in leadership. Folly will hurt you in the end. Wisdom helps you accomplish what you're setting out to do. Wisdom helps you speak in ways that benefit you and others. A fool talks, it doesn't help anyone. You can see the advantage of wisdom in comparing what happens when a country has effective leaders and when they don't. Fifth, in light of the unpredictability of life, give and stop worrying about the future and get to work, trusting that God knows better than you do. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. Rejoice in the life that you've been given while you have it. Chapter 11, verses 7 through 10. And then seventh, as you enjoy life, always do so, remembering that you'll stand before God because that time is coming and is coming quickly. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. After all that, we come to the conclusion. In case in the middle of all this talking and arguing and explaining, we've gotten a bit lost, the narrator comes back on the scene in chapter 12, verses 9 through 14 to just sum everything up. And he ends this book by saying, look, son, I want you to think about what the teacher said. Be careful about the advice you get outside of God's word. Fear God and keep his commandments. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Enjoy life, but remember that there's a judgment, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes is a little bit of a strange book, but I think it's an especially important book right now because we so often live as if we weren't going to die and stand before God. And that causes us to make very many foolish choices. If you're going to live a life that makes sense, there's a sense in which you have to live life backwards. You have to think about the day you stand before the judgment of God. You have to think about the day that you die. And as you build your life, you've got to build your life in light of this reality that is most definitely coming. You will die and you will stand before the judgment of God. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, one thing you can do is read Ecclesiastes, because that's why this book is written. It's written to help you live a life that makes sense in this broken world.